Hi everyone, fellow time travellers. Strap in and get ready because it's a brilliant guest time. We're going to have another inspiring and informative conversation with somebody well worth listening to. But before I get started, quick reminder to check out my patreon.com site. By signing up, you support us practically, and in every other way you get early access to the new content, exclusive access to the question and answer session. It's great. Come and join us. Make it better by being there. Okay, let's talk. Hi everyone, it's time for another important chat, another important conversation, to hear another viewpoint, to let us glimpse the world, the mad world as it is just now, through other eyes. The more views we can get on all of this, the better, I would say. The guest in question today is a friend of mine, David Freiheit, known online as Viva Frei. We've been talking online and been in communication for a while now. And we tend to be on the same wavelength, which is always interesting. David, good afternoon.
Well, it's morning time behind the Iron Rainbow. I'm up in Canada now, which I've now dubbed the Iron Rainbow or the Maple Gulag, depending on which one you want to go with.
Just the sight and the sound of you makes me feel better at once, David. I have to say, I was watching some more of your recent content online. I was watching you at the RNC in Milwaukee, and like me, you've grown steadily hairier as the years of madness have gone on. I remember looking back over the years when you were quite the clean-cut young lawyer.
I remember.
What do you think the hairiness is about?
Oh, the joke was that I remember the last time I got an official haircut, it was September 2021 when I was running for office for the People's Party of Canada in Canada. I got a nice buzz cut with a skin fade. I used to go to a barber up on Monkland, and they would give me a nice skin fade where it would be like as bald on the side of my head as it was on my face. And then at some point I started making the joke, like I let the hair grow, and then I said I'm going to let it grow until I get freedom. And we called it the Freedom Fro. And then I ended up in Florida with, freedom. But then I changed the rules of the game. I said, I'm going to cut it when the world has freedom, so I can reserve the right to not cut it ever. Because, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've always tended, for the longest time, I've had longer than average hair. But more recently, I've almost it's almost crystallized into a thought that, like you just said, I might not get my hair in any way altered until the world looks a whole lot better. So the hirsute nature could get worse and worse.
Well, I mean, there is something about hair representing freedom and representing the pursuit of freedom. Like the first thing anybody does or any institution does when it wants to demoralize and strip identity is shave your hair. Like shave you bald so that everybody looks the same. Not that there's anything wrong with being bald. Bruce Willis did it very well. There's a bunch of people who did it very well. But, the hair, it represents something of a spiritual statement. I've sort of gone off the rails in a sense. Like the world has gone off the rails, and the need to be clean cut, prim and proper. I no longer feel compelled by that because I feel compelled by something a little bit more important than physical appearance. But I like the hair. That's the other thing. Is I've grown rather attached, maybe superficially so, to a silly thing.
I know. It's good. Anything that alleviates the feeling of downward pressure is a good thing. You're just back from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. Was it different? Was that a different convention than normal? Was it made different by the unforgettable recent events that preceded it?
I had never been to one of these things before. I was at the Republican debate in Milwaukee, whenever that was, about a year ago. So I had been to Milwaukee for one of these events. They had it at the Pfizer Center. Security was obviously something much different because of what had not happened in the world yet, but also the debates were not exactly the RNC convention. Robert Barnes, my partner-in-law, as I like to say, he had been to the convention in 2016, and he said it was just wildly different. Forget the security for obvious reasons. They did not have sort of like an open to the public interior of the perimeter. So it was credentials only, registration only. You had to go through security to get into the epicenter of the perimeter. On the outside, it was open to pedestrian traffic, but still there was a security perimeter. There were some counter protesters, but I have nothing to compare it to. All that I know is that when I was there, it did not have a somber, depressing feeling. It was very much like a rebirth of sorts. It felt a lot more like the Ottawa trucker protest in spirit and jovialness, at least with the people that I was mingling with. And I think it's because everybody really feels like they had been reborn with a life that I don't know if we didn't deserve it, but we certainly didn't expect it, given what had happened 2 days earlier. I was driving down to Wisconsin. So I'm driving from Montreal. We stop in Toronto. Then we go to Wisconsin. And we stopped in a place called Kalamazoo, Michigan. And I go for a jog. I have my phone with me, but I put it on Do Not Disturb because I hate getting disturbed when I'm jogging. And when I flip it back on, it's like, blowing up with messages. I get up to the hotel room and my wife says, "Did you hear what happened?" And that was 2 days before the convention. By the grace of God, it went from, it would have been a funeral at which Nikki Haley would have proudly taken the podium to being a rebirth of a presidency and hopefully a rebirth of something of a spiritual rebirth of society as a whole, because we witnessed a miracle that Saturday.
I was, amongst much else, in relation to contemplating what had gone on. I was very struck by the way when the bullets flew, and in the immediate aftermath, I don't know, you might have expected people to run, scatter, and they didn't. There was people stood up, and people obviously wanted to see, get a better view of what had happened, but there was immediate defiance. Obviously, Donald Trump stood up and was the living embodiment of defiance within 30 seconds. But I wonder if that extended in a way that there was some kind of renewed confidence or a sense of determination to stand in place that manifests itself.
I noticed it too. One of the things I always forget to mention is, the defiance of Trump standing up and putting his fist in the air with blood on his head saying "fight, fight, fight" is one thing. But the crowd then chanting America, it was USA or America, I forget which one now, but I noticed that as well. People ducked, as they should. I mean, you can't blame them. There's a reflexive nature to this, but nobody panicked. There wasn't a stampede like you might otherwise expect, or that might have otherwise occurred at a different venue. And I mean, I think there's a little element of shock. People knew shots had been fired, but I don't think people fully appreciated that Trump got struck in the upper earlobe with a bullet, and people might have thought it was glass or something else. So I don't think people fully appreciated how close we came to a cataclysmic, world-changing event. And I'm sure once all of that initial, what's that body chemical? Adrenaline. Once the adrenaline wore off, I'm pretty sure people were like, "Holy crap, that was scary." But the initial reaction was something of collective defiance, but also collective calm. But I don't think people realized how close it came to being cataclysmically disastrous.
And it was almost tempting to overlook the physicality of what he did. He's a man of an age. He's in his late 70s, and he was winged by a bullet. That passed by his head. Well, didn't pass by his head. Passed through his ear. And Lloyd absolutely correctly dropped Drawley to take. I think that's what looked like bunting on the front of the stage is actually armour. And I think he quite rightly dropped, to assess the situation. But for a man of that age, having just experienced what he'd experienced, to be up on his feet, fist raised, was truly something to behold.
Neil, I don't want to say superhuman, because it might have been a stupid response on Trump's behalf. They say shooter down, threats neutralized, but we still don't know if there was one or multiple shooters. So he didn't know that the threat had been officially and thoroughly and completely neutralized. He doesn't want to get whisked off, on a stretcher. He doesn't want to crawl off like a coward. He doesn't know that the threat has been totally neutralized, but stands up nonetheless. Look, I mean, I've watched a couple of gun show channels as well, people trying to recreate the attempt. And some of them are saying, look, even if the bullet passes that close to your ear, you're probably going to have some sort of ear damage. You might be not concussed, but at the very least shake it up. Like, people hear loud bangs and it creates a ringing in their ear, and that's distracting enough. I don't think he knew what the hell was going on. It was the most guttural, instinctual reaction, which makes it even more authentic and more beautiful. There wasn't the reaction to duck, cover, say, "Get me the hell out of here," like some other politicians, some other people might have said, and understandably so. He didn't cry. He didn't whimper. I'm sure he was shaking a little bit later. His reaction, whether or not it was premeditated or purely reflexive, was to get up and put a fist in the air and say, "Fight, fight, fight," and the crowd to say, "USA, USA, USA." It went from being the most cataclysmically disastrous event in human history to what I hope is a shift in the zeitgeist and a shift going forward as to America's trajectory and the trajectory of the world. It's spiritual. I tell you, I've been saying it. I'm not religious, but I'm open-minded. And what I saw right there, I'm keep quoting Pulp Fiction. I believe it was a bona fide miracle, an act of divine intervention, and I struggle to reconcile that with my sort of agnostic perspective of the world.
You know, you and I, we grew up. I think we're rough, well, contemporary enough, and but we lived our lives, and we were raised, both of us, in countries with the closest possible ties, emotionally and culturally and whatever, to the United States of America. You in Canada, and me in Britain. And so, of course, we both grew up internalizing and imbibing a sense of America, American culture, American music, American movies, American politics, and all of the rest of it. But with all of that behind us now, what do you make of USA today?
I don't struggle with this. I think about this often. Like we grew up in Canada, and for good and for bad, we had our perspectives of Americans. We listened to the music, we loved the movies, et cetera, et cetera. And yet also and I'm saying we collectively, but I don't, I might have at one point been guilty of this. We adhered also to, the most juvenile stereotypes of Americans and what we think American culture was: loud, obnoxious, gun-toting, et cetera, et cetera. And it's an interesting thing. Like, I think a lot of Canadians still harbor that stereotype, but if you refine that stereotype, there is a bit of a different culture of America that can be summarized like that. It's not rude, brash, and abrasive. It's independent, freedom-loving, and not shy to tell people to go, bugger off when they deserve it. And that is the American spirit, and what explains the history of America as being one that defied tyrants, fought for their liberty, versus Canadians, which got bequeathed their privileges and rights from the royalty. There's a different culture, and it's what made America what it is today. The problem is now, and I've been living in America and I'm witnessing it firsthand, there is a competition for the culture, for the history and the future of America that's being fought by people who are fundamentally un-American in spirit. They're American citizens. They've got their passports. They were born in America. I could humorously refer to them as communists because their perspective of the world more closely resembles communism than the live free or die American spirit. And so living there now, I'm witnessing this battle in real time of what I will call some sort of collectivist, socialist, communist takeover, fighting for the spirit of America, but the other half is fighting back politically, spiritually as well. That's a rambling answer now. I sort of almost forgot the question, but it's an amazing. The perspective of America right now is there's a battle for its existence and almost a battle for its past. And there's the current part that's battling not just for the future of America, but in doing so to erase its history that made it what it was. And there's a reason why Americans are the way they are. There's a reason why the people who moved to America historically were the way they were, and it shaped the way the country has evolved over time. Now it's being taken over by something far different, and it's an existential battle for the soul of America.
You mentioned communism, socialism. I agree, but I also think that there's barely a cigarette paper's thickness to be slipped between communism and fascism in many ways. I think it's totalitarianism, absolutism, and dictatorial. And I think whether it be communist or whether it be some other flavour of ideology, it comes down to an elite wanting control. And I wonder what you think when you think that insidious rising floodwater got into America. And perhaps more pertinently, why is it that so many of us, people like me, and I don't consider myself to have been the most astute observer over time, I've woken up relatively recently, why have they nudged it to the point where so many people can see it now, and so many people are so determinedly alarmed by it and determined to do something to thwart it?
Yeah, I think the typical thing is the elites typically get to a point of hubris where they overplay their hand on the issue of communism versus whatever. I agree with you 1,000%. I would more appropriately qualify it as statism. People who defer to the authority of the state, whether that's Hitler or Stalin. The issue in both fascist and communist and socialist regimes is government controls everything. And government works with media for propaganda. Government works with corporation to solidify their control. So yeah, we'll call it statism so that people don't say you're using communism inaccurately, because I get told that all the time. It's statism. And it's what we're witnessing in Canada right now. Why I think so many people are waking up to it is it's reaching something of a critical mass where people are saying, yeah, for the greater good, but holy cows, at some point, the greater good no longer is for the greater good. And, the expression, there's iterations of it in all cultures. Scotland has a good one where it says, the father earns, the grandfather spends. It's something along the lines of the grandfather worked, the father spends, the child begs. And it's the iteration of, rice paddy to rice paddy in 3 generations. Hardworking men and women build something. They then give it to the next generation who appreciates it but didn't build it. And then they get to the next generation that didn't build it and doesn't appreciate it and thinks it's always been this way, and then they destroy it. And so that's where we're at right now. It's the, hard times make hard men make easy times make easy men, and easy men make hard times. We're sort of at that point right now where the people have inherited something that they didn't build and that they don't appreciate. And they think it's always been that way and it's always going to be that way, forgetting that there are wolves, scoundrels, and demons out there who want to take it from them and take their freedoms for their own personal profit and control. And we're at that point now. And I think, but for the advent of the internet and the free exchange of ideas, it would be much easier to control what people know and the extent to which they know it. But the internet being the wild west of the information age and the true, not free speech, but free dissemination of ideas and democratization of information, people are waking up and people are seeing it. But there's also a reason why they want to censor and control the internet as much as they do. And they being government.
Is it a curse to be born to live through such a time? Or is it some sort of privilege to be witness to and party to the kind of paradigm shifting events that we seem to be on the cusp of?
It's the Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times. I'm sure everybody's era was always interesting. Living through the pyramids being built must have been interesting as well, but what a long period of time. And the people who were born for the first brick never saw the last brick. It's wild. I mean, what other era would you want to be alive in? You've got relative peace, a relatively longer lifespan than we've ever had in the history of humankind. We've got the most amazing technology for good and for bad, for creative and for destructive. But I think we are living through objective history. The 68 to 70 some odd turmoil, historical. But I think it pales in comparison to what we're witnessing right now. World War II, I mean, can't imagine living through anything like that and being era-defining times. But we're living through era-defining times right now. I mean, we lived through an attempted assassination that would have plunged the world into World War III. And I'm not being hyperbolic about this. I had to go back and refresh my memory as to the history of Franz Ferdinand and how that sole assassination plunged the world into the Great War. And the analogies are, history doesn't repeat, but it tends to rhyme. The analogies are amazing. And if that bullet had caught its mark, you would have had American society devolving into hot conflict, violence, civil unrest, and civil war. You would have had Russia and China saying, holy crap, the global superpower is eating itself. Let's go do what we want to do in Ukraine and Taiwan. And then you would have had triggering all sorts of NATO provisions and whatever. And we would have plunged into World War III, which is what really drives me nuts about these idiot lefties who make jokes about, next time don't miss. They don't understand what would have happened because they don't understand history. They don't understand the present, and they can't predict the future. All that they can see, like children, like a dog, is just let me into the garbage. I don't care if it makes me sick. I'm going to eat it until my stomach is content, and then be rushed off to the hospital. But can you imagine living through any other time? I mean, it's we got COVID, we got Trump presidency number 1, then we got COVID, then we got Ukraine, then we've got an assassination, we've got politics unraveling before our eyes, and we're seeing the veil being lifted or being burnt before our eyes, and everybody's seeing what's been behind the veil the entire time.
I've said on my channel before, but my wife Trudy said to me years ago now that in 2016, because Trump was elected first time around on one side of the Atlantic, and on this side of the Atlantic, Britain, by the largest plebiscite in British voting history voted to leave the European Union. She said that both of those things were off script. They weren't predicted. They weren't supposed to happen. And she says that everything that's happened since has been a sustained punishment beating to get the uppity, pesky people back in their box, ready for the completion of the agenda, which is whatever, forever war, perpetual unrest and all of the rest of it. Do you think she's on the money there?
I'm not necessarily about the punishment part, but we certainly witnessed a glitch in the Matrix in 2016 with Trump being elected, with Brexit. I think it's the machine trying to regain control. And so whether or not it's punishment or just an attempt to right their globalist ship and undo what should never have happened. But I mean, can you imagine say the glitch in the Matrix that led to Trump being elected, the populist revolt that led to Brexit, and it's almost like a literal glitch in the Matrix where someone does this, and instead of being in a world of absolute permanent war, total control, martial law, locking down society, voting by mail because of civil unrest, we're now in a world where there are congressional hearings as to how the hell this happened. There's an exposure to what we all knew was a deep state, administrative state, unelected body that determines the future of America, the future of the world. We've seen it in real time. So the definite glitch, and they're trying to get back on track. I think the issue is the wheels are coming off. Like, in as much as society sort of not devolves, but it's, rice paddy to rice paddy in 3 generations, that also applies to the deep state apparatus. It had its heyday, and now the people taking control of it are utterly incompetent and don't know how to work it. And so you go from the George Soroses of the world, who I'll give him credit. He's an evil mastermind. He's figured out how to destabilize countries by being very cost effective with his political financing. Go grassroots, go small government. You get more small municipal elections, state elections. You get more bang for your buck than trying to interfere with a national election. But you go from George Soros, evil genius, to Alex Soros, evil idiot. I mean, they're not going to be able to maintain this machine that they built. So that too shall pass. That too shall collapse. And I think we might be in the midst of that right now. Just let me explain what this is. This is one of those cups that you get when you put your baby foot on it. And I realized when I was drinking from it, it looks extremely sinister. So I'm going to keep it I'll keep it on the corner, but just so nobody had any conspiracy theories, this is either a child or a niece or a nephew's footprint on a ceramic mug.
I look on at I'm preoccupied by the push for war, ever escalating war, the sword of Damocles threat of global thermonuclear war. Talk in my country and elsewhere about the necessity of conscription, citizen armies, and I've got 2 boys of the wrong age, when it comes to conscription, which is to say the right age for conscription. Mm-hmm. I cannot make heads nor tails of what's going on unless I reluctantly submit to the conclusion that at some level we are dealing with something. Now, you mentioned your agnosticism or whatever, but I think we're dealing with some kind of evil, some kind of anti-human ideology and agenda. But for that, I cannot make sense of the constant push coming out of Washington, coming out of London, and from elsewhere to make matters worse in terms of war in Europe.
It is. I mean, look, we're dealing with. First of all, war has always been and will always be, because you're dealing with greedy, narcissist, power-seeking. Call them psychopaths. I mean, I say evil, demonic, psychopathic, narcissistic. I mean, we're describing people who are so power hungry they will use the literal blood and flesh of other humans to further their political global agendas. They always find a way to rationalize it to themselves. It's always, it's always for the greater good or for national interests. But we're dealing with people who are power hungry tyrants, but who have rationalized and justified their own pursuit to rationalize war. And for sure they'll send off a few of their own kids, and they'll say, look, my son served in Iraq. This is what one of the current, I won't say war whores, but a person who could be qualified as that in the American government invokes their own service to justify escalating the conflict in Ukraine. I was like, oh, so you didn't learn the right lessons from the sacrifice of a generation who fought and died for a lie of a war. Anybody who says I served in Iraq and now that further justifies my support for the war in Ukraine didn't learn the lesson from the service in Iraq, which was a useless war that killed millions of people. I mean, say like at least 500,000 Iraqis, predicated on a lie. It was nothing but regime change for economic financial interests of what we refer to as the military-industrial complex, but they found a way to rationalize it. So, what's the question? I mean, I think what I'm wondering.
I think the question is it chaos, destruction, and war as a means, or is it chaos, destruction, and war as the end in itself? I've come to wonder if we have somehow created an ecosystem that has enabled to thrive and to reproduce itself a kind of a subspecies, a parasitical, psychopathic subspecies of humanity that actually wants chaos for chaos' sake.
You see, that would be a question where that distinction as to the intent changes nothing as it relates to the outcome. So whether or not it's for chaos' sake or whether or not it's just to maintain perpetual control, I'm an Orwellian, if we say it like that. The war was not meant to be won. It was meant to be perpetual. And that is so that government can always justify its existence, justify its control, justify the evils that it does in the name of necessity. And so, it might be human nature to some extent. Anybody who has kids can understand why there can't be peace in the Middle East, because kids will fight over a nanogram of an inequity in the cutting of a cookie. And it doesn't really change with certain adults. Sorry, this is funny. What I've discovered is that adults who we would qualify as being animals are basically just children in adults' bodies. Excuse me. They're basically just adults that are grown-up children. And they fight over stupid stuff. They're incapable of taking a step back and just appreciating the absurdity of it. Children will fight over a crumb of a cookie. Humans will fight over things of principle that send millions of people to their death. Can't compromise, can't show weakness, et cetera, et cetera. So, but we end up being governed by these people. And true, I think the perpetual war, perpetual crisis, perpetual doom and gloom is a way for them to exercise perpetual control over the masses. And so whether it's to perpetuate evil or just human nature of some people, the outcome is the same. It'll be throughout history that war crisis is the most useful tool for political elites to retain control over basically all aspects of society.
I should definitely ask you about Canada though, because I'm British, I'm also Scottish, and Scottish people traditionally have very strong familial connections to Canada and Canadians. I've got extended family who emigrated to Canada 2 or 3 generations ago, and that's true of so many people in not just in Scotland but in Britain. We feel a strong sense of family with Canada for all sorts of obvious reasons. And I grew up certainly looking on at Canada as being probably the most peaceful, benign, benevolent manifestation of human society that I could ever have thought of. Safe, wide open spaces, kindly, friendly people. How on earth has that population ended up in the predicament that it's in with its ruling class, for want of a more apposite word?
Well, I'll tell you one thing, Neil. This picture right here is taken in Scotland, right at the entrance to the Isle of Skye. So it's pointing back out. Like, I think Skye was behind us. Scotland's among the most beautiful places on earth. It's an interesting thing. And how has it happened? I think it's specifically happened because of the difference of culture between the history and zeitgeist of America versus the history and zeitgeist of Canada. A nation founded on not necessarily having fought for its freedom from a tyrannical, not patriarchal, but the word for kings and queens, having been granted their freedoms by royalty, is fundamentally different than people who fought for their freedoms. And so you sit there and you say, we're polite, we defer to authority. It's what makes us who we are. In the stereotypes of movies, Americans are rude, brash, etc. Canadians are prim, proper, and polite. It makes them very easy to govern and very easy to exploit. And it places the value on the wrong things, where you think that there is moral value in being passive and being docile and being subservient. And there's somehow moral turpitude in being abrasive, defiant, and freedom loving. But when you deal with a society like that, it makes it very easy to govern them just at large. You get psychopaths and narcissists like Justin Trudeau who come in and then say, in the name of benevolence, you've got to be polite and you've got to defer to my authority and do everything I say. And it makes it very easy to govern internally. It also makes it very easy to exploit internationally. And you get other players on the geopolitical scene like the Chinese Communist Party with global aspirations and looking for easy targets to infiltrate and overrun. Infiltrate for passivity, for politeness, and overrun for, our leaders also have this faux sense of benevolence that whatever they're doing is for the greater good. Ban straws, cut energy, cripple the Canadian economy, and do it. The suffering will be benevolent suffering. But it makes our country easy to take over. And I do believe in no exaggerated, hyperbolic sense, our country has been taken over by international interests, whether it's the Chinese Communist Party, the Indian government, or just, the WEF elements who have found it very easy to penetrate our government and, impose their 2030 agendas on a very polite population that thinks when the government tells you to stay home and shut your door and go under curfew, you do it. And if you don't do it, you're a bad citizen. But if you do it, you're the good citizen. So this is it. It's the politeness is a double-edged sword. It's good to be polite normally, but not when people are trying to take advantage of you.
We watched, well, the world watched, I suppose, the truckers, the protests, the freedom movement there. And it was such a bright, inspiring, it was longer than a moment, it sustained for a while. And it seemed at the time that it was at its peak that you were going to tip something over. That was going to turn back the waves. And I wonder, is that spirit that manifests there and then still there? And I listen to you. I don't know how typical you are I don't know enough Canadian people really to know that if your ebullient, irreverent spirit is typical of a Canadian personality. I don't know, but is that defiant spirit still there?
I'll say, to my dismay, no, I don't think it's still there. Certainly not to the degree to which it was during the protest. If statistics are anything, I am not the typical Canadian. I don't know what the typical Canadian is, but I can just say, as far as my milieu of friends,
that was my hunch.
If I just go by these stats of my friends and family, or I should say former friends, they're still family, but yeah, I'm definitely in the minority of demeanor and perspective. And I got called names at the time, but the truckers were the spiritual backbone of Canada, but nonetheless a demographic minority. And that was what was revelatory about the protests. Is it was a small percentage out there fighting for freedom in the most passive, peaceful way possible. And then you still had the vast majority, or at least a substantial portion of Canada, demonizing them as heretics, as selfish, as quasi-American in spirit. Like, how dare they not shut up and stay home for the greater good? How dare they not take that stupid jab for the greater good? What are they complaining about? It's just an itty bitty needle. Too many Canadians were like that. And I sincerely believe we were at an inflection point where it would have not just been a national tipping over, but an international. I think it did to some extent. And then, what do the narcissist tyrants do when they get embarrassed? They abuse you even harder. Trudeau came in, and I think he crushed that spirit violently with force. And then I remember how black-pilled and depressed I was right after the day of violence where they shut the protest down. And I was like, oh, well, we'll have our hearing before the commission to determine whether or not Trudeau was right in invoking the Emergencies Act. I was like, oh, I didn't realize then that there's a Chapter 2 and that the white pill, redemption comes after Act 2, and I thought it was over after Act 1. And then that stupid commission ratifies Trudeau's invocation of the Emergencies Act. And I'm like, oh, now it's black pill time for me. But then you never really know what chapter of the story you're at, because history will never be fully written. And so you don't know where it's going to end and what's going to happen in the future. After the invocation of the Emergencies Act was ratified by Commissioner Rouleau, I felt despaired yet again. But we're in the midst now, hopefully, of something of a political revolution, not just in Canada, but throughout the world. But my goodness, yeah, that was a minority of people who represented the best of humanity. And I think slowly but surely over time, it's taken a long time, and things have to get really bad for even the others to open their eyes. I think we're getting there now, but not fast enough.
How do you feel about your homeland now? You know, I know you spend a lot of your time, certainly recently, in the US. What is the nature of your marriage to Canada?
Um, a divorce. I mean, I don't feel good saying it because I don't feel good feeling it. It's like it is. I made the joke. It's like coming back and visiting an ex-girlfriend who's turned into a monster, a junkie, or so. You know, it's like you remember your beautiful, how much you were in love with someone, and you saw them change, and then you're like, okay, we'll take a break, and then you go back and visit, and they're not the same person anymore. I crossed the border into Canada. Geographically, it's just exquisite. It's heaven on earth. You cross the border from Vermont or New York into Quebec, and farmlands, beautiful homes, green, lush scenery, lakes, rivers. But then first of all, then you step foot into the cities, and it feels like you're stepping into an insane asylum. Like, in as much as I say people are starting to get woken up a little bit more exponentially, you walk into Montreal, there's people still wearing masks, and I don't judge them for the mask wearing. I feel bad for them for the level of trauma that they're still broken from COVID. You still have people saying, you know, it was because of the others that we are where we are today. So it feels like I'm stepping into an insane asylum, just spiritually. Physically, when I walk the streets, the homelessness in Montreal is out of control. Socially, down the street from where I used to live, they've erected a safe injection and a safe inhalation site right across the street from the Atwater Market, one of the major tourist attractions in Montreal, right next door, divided by a fence from a playground, a block away from the school that goes to that playground. And this is because our leaders have told us it's benevolent to allow drug addicts to inject and smoke crack in open air so long as they do it safely. And so, I mean, politically, spiritually, existentially, I feel like I'm coming into an insane asylum. They've destroyed the cities with open immigration. Homelessness is out of control. The indigenous, the native population is disproportionately suffering from drug addiction, alcoholism, and homelessness. And our government says we don't have the means to take care of the citizens because we're shipping money off to fund foreign conflict in Ukraine and abroad. So I get very angry when I come back here because I don't like what I see. I don't feel that it's my home anymore. And I feel that it has been turned into a prison. And so I come across the border, you know, my friends and family who are, you know, they're well-to-do. They don't suffer from certain problems that others suffer from. And so it's not bad enough yet. Oh yeah, sure, it's not great, but for the greater good type thing. And they don't understand it. And I, you know, having gone to Florida, I've traveled around America now, having seen it, and America's got its problems as well. But I step back into Montreal and Canada. I feel like I'm in an asylum, and I feel like I'm in a country that hates me. Not from my neighborly necessarily, but from a government perspective. And I feel like I'm in a country that is in absolute radical decline and will not, you know, will reach a tipping point or a proverbial event horizon from which it will never be able to escape, and will be Venezuela in 5 to 10 years.
And the USA, well, obviously joining the dots is not for you moving from the frying pan into the fire.
Well,
I mean, I look on it both. I mean, they're very different. You know, what happened and is happening in Canada is very different existentially from what's happening in America. But neither option looks particularly appealing.
No, there's no, and had that bullet caught its mark, you know, people might have been saying, well, holy crap, I'm going to escape this civil war and go back to Canada. No, America has its similar problems, and it might not be Canadian of essence. It might be big city, big government of essence. It might be a form of government that's no longer sustainable. But, you know, in the States, what I've appreciated at the very least, there is a quasi-religious respect for the First Amendment, freedom of speech. There's a quasi-religious respect for the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. And that defines and protects a culture much more than a charter of rights that nobody respects. And that spirit protects a culture much more than deference to authority, which is sort of what Canada can be defined as, or the Canadian spirit. There's much more respect for state independence in the States from federal encroachment, although the feds want to control everything. But in Canada, look, you know, there's the federal government basically has an arm in every province, and there's very little respect for provincial autonomy. So when the poop hits the fan here, there's really nowhere to go. In the States, at least, there's states that are defined. Texas, Florida, I want to say Tennessee. I'm looking for New Hampshire. And the courts sort of uphold state independence. So if things go totally south or totally sideways, and there is a balkanization of America, there will be free states and there will be commie Canadian states like California and New York. But as far as the fight goes, America and Canada they're going through the same type of existential conflict, fight for freedom, but the fight is being fought a little bit stronger, a little bit harder, and with a little more infrastructure in the States. Canada seems to have just basically said, do as you will with us, so long as we can have our cafes on the street and the semblance of peace.
I'm glad, I'm certainly interested that you invoked the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, because if someone had said to me even 5 years ago that there would come a day when I had looked again at the spirit of the Second Amendment and come to the conclusion that a population that can be armed to protect itself from a tyrannical government, I would not have believed it. I was so indoctrinated, I suppose, with the statist necessity to disarm the population for the greater good. But now I look on at the Second Amendment and think, I see the I see the wisdom of that. I absolutely see the wisdom, and I'm also aware that there's a nascent return in so many ways. I see it here to a kind of a basic intrinsic, call it masculinity, maybe. You can see it in the younger generation. I think particularly, it's quite sharp that there are young men out there who are awakening as though from slumber, societal slumber, and seem to be recognizing the necessity to stand up in every interpretation of what it means to stand up and to put their shoulders to the wheel and to accept personal responsibility and to shake off, to slough away the dead skin of that which has unmanned them and unmanned society. And I do wonder if I have been persuaded to look again at something as basic as the Second Amendment in the United States of American Constitution. I wonder how much other people are thinking along those lines at the same time.
It's, Neil, I mean, I can think of three litmus tests, issues that I've had an evolution on in my lifetime. We don't need to get into all three, but abortion, once I realized what black market corruption exists for aborted fetal parts, really changed my perspective on that. What was it? Well, the Second Amendment is another one. Oh, and the death penalty. Young and wet behind the ears, in an ideal world, yeah, death penalty, kill the criminals, et cetera, et cetera. And then you live through enough of life to realize that the government can frame whomever they want, and then you really can't trust anybody to administer the ultimate punishment against somebody. Second Amendment, born and raised in Canada. I was born and spoon-fed I'll call it the propaganda talking point. You don't need an AR-15 to hunt deer. That's great. The Second Amendment was not about hunting. And once you understand that it wasn't about hunting, it was not only about militias either to protect against a tyrannical government, it was about your God-given right to self-defense. And once the government comes in and says, you no longer have the God-given right to self-defense, we'll do that for you. Well, you're no longer a free subject. You are an object of the government. You are a
slave,
a pet. And people make fun of the Second Amendment, and they cite all sorts of, I'll say, wildly distorted gun crime or gun violence statistics to justify their untenable position that firearms should be banned and nobody should have them except for the government. Like, you want to give the monopoly of violence to a corrupt government that we've seen corrupt beyond the pale. But then you spend a little time looking into it, and you look at Mexico, South American countries, some of the strictest gun laws on earth and some of the highest gun violence on earth. I've lived through the evolution in Canada, stricter and stricter gun laws. I used to be a gun owner in Canada before I left, but And you think, oh, stricter and stricter gun laws. I got to go take a 2-day course. I got to get background checks. I got to register because I'm in Quebec, register my firearm with the government so the government knows what I have in my house. And if they want to leak that information or they want to frame a politically unpopular citizen, very easy to do. Go raid a house, load the firearm, accuse the person of improper storage of the firearm, 2 years in jail. Once I've realized that, people are jealous ultimately of the Second Amendment right, but they need to rationalize their own misery by demonizing the free. And there was another issue about this, the Second Amendment. Oh, no, it's having lived through it in Canada, where stricter and stricter gun laws, and yet gun violence goes up and up because once you disarm the law-abiding population, you don't disarm the criminal population. And all that you end up doing is creating a subservient population to a corrupt government by stripping them of their God-given autonomy. So I've had a wild, I don't know if it's a 360 because I'd be back to the same point, a 180 on Second Amendment rights because I've lived through it and I've lived through it enough to see. When the poop hits the fan, I feel much better being in Florida knowing that all of my neighbors are heavily armed. I don't worry about my neighbors using their guns to shoot me any more than I worry about my neighbors using their guns to run me over, their cars to run me over. But when there's the risk of social upheaval, when there's the risk of criminality because the government's not doing their job, then I feel a whole hell of a lot better being among heavily armed people than being among sitting ducks.
Yeah, I'm 57, and I lived the first 50 some years of my life believing that the state was just benign. It wasn't it wasn't at the forefront of my mind. It was something subconscious, really, something that I didn't really pay any attention to. I just broadly assumed that whether it be a government of the left or of the right or of the centre of whatever, that the fundamentals were there to look after my family and me. Keep the bins collected, the lights on, food in the supermarket, schools open, safe borders. They were all just doing that, regardless of their specific political ideologies. And that really was the drug that in me induced the state of slumber in which I lived all of my life. And I will never, for as long as I continue to live, forget the sensation of realizing one day, just in the last few years, that I felt afraid of my government. And not specifically because it was a conservative government, which it was, but of the state. I had never felt that before. It was as though, that kind of amygdala, reptilian, primitive bit of my brain had flicked for the first time, and I felt it. I had this physiological sense of threat from the state that I had never felt before. And I know that the way in which I woke up in that moment, I'll never go back to sleep again. And for me, that's why I think, yes, you're right. The God-given right to protect yourself, the God-given right as a parent to protect your family. And in fact, it's not even a right, it's an obligation. It's not just that you have the right to do that. It's that you are morally obliged, however uncomfortable it might be, to stand up in the face of tyrannical authority. You don't actually get morally, in terms of the natural law and the common law, to take the knee to that. It's not a choice. You're obliged to get up in the face of it, Neil, no matter how ruinous might be the consequences.
We've had the same revelation, and it's an interesting thing. Like, you once upon a time looked at government as though they were there to protect you because you're a good person and you see good in others. I guarantee you, criminals never looked at the government like they were there to protect them. And you say, well, that's only because you're up to criminality and the government is there to punish criminality. But also, we have been indoctrinated from birth to think that the government is like our parent or our mother or a father. When they're not, they never will be. Like, if you have decent parents who do what they're supposed to do, they will unconditionally love you and they will always look out for your best interest, even over their own. And people have been brought up to think that's what the government does. It's the exact opposite. It's like you're being raised by opportunistic criminals of the highest order. And I realize the government is always what it was and always will be, a corrupt corporation with its own interests, and those are not mine. The government will never be my father or my mother. They will never want my well-being over their own. And once you realize that, and then you just go and you look back. I remember I was 21 after 9/11, and I bought into all of it. The Iraq War, weapons of mass destruction, and then once you realize it was all a lie.
It feels so stupid.
No, I feel like an idiot. I was parroting their talking points. Oh, they got weapons of mass destruction. 5 days into the war, no weapons of mass destruction. Oh, but they were shooting Scud missiles at Israel, and Scud missiles could be loaded with chemical weapons, so that qualifies as the WMDs. They got me to make their talking points. Luckily, at the time, I didn't talk politics with anybody. It was just like family discussions. But you realize they lied to you. They lied to the world. And they sent people to their death, and they killed hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And then you think, oh, well, that was just 9/11 Iraq wars. No, throughout the history of the government. And once you understand that, you thought you were sitting there sleeping with a little puppy dog, and it's been a vicious animal. And once it bites you once, well, you never go back to looking at it the same way. But once you understand the government has always lied throughout its history, it's a necessary evil that needs to be kept to its absolute smallest, and autonomy of the people to the absolute greatest extent. You never go back to being normal.
Do you think it's an unintended consequence? Because it's a heck of a bold move otherwise for the state, whatever, the elite, the ruling group, whatever, to unmask itself in this way, because it's a Rubicon crossed. I also had internalized the notion of a social contract. The idea that in return for my basic obedience, really, my law-abiding nature, my willingness to pay income tax and all of the rest of it, that there was a quid pro quo. That, all of the freedom. I was a free citizen. I had the right to speak as I thought and think as I thought. I was allowed to go wherever I wanted and buy whatever I wanted, and so on and so on. The quid pro quo was there, and now all of that has been quite blatantly taken away. In the last 4 years, we saw it with nothing in return. What do I get in return for losing all of that? Nothing. It's a very bold move for those, whatever their thinking is, to have made, because once people like you and me, and we have, faced up to the embarrassing, humiliating realization that we were just duped, we were just willing dupes. That's a very annoyed, indignant, unforgiving population to inspire to be suspicious of you forever.
True, but there's a certain element that's analogous to internet and viral videos. Like they say that viral videos will go viral because they appeal to a human core sentiment. And the same videos can go viral. Like you say, every 5 to 7 years, you'll notice something similar will go viral again, because you're dealing with the next generation of content consumers. I do think the government has awakened a great many people. The problem is collective memory is what it is, that in 5 to 7 years, you're going to be dealing with a new generation of subjects who were born after 9/11. Who was I with? I was on Tim Pool with Riley Gaines. And, she doesn't need any red pills or anything. She's totally, all there. Despite the fact that she was born post 9/11, or at least she was born in 2000. She didn't live through 9/11. And her awakening came from another series of cataclysmic events, or at least quasi-cataclysmic, the denying that women are women. And that woke her up. But the problem is, you realize that there's a generation, like, I don't know, a quarter of the population that never lived through 9/11. And so they don't truly appreciate it. And so they're born and grown up in the new normal of what they think government is and should be. Then they have their awakening or their moment of revelation through a crisis or whatever. And they've learned, but then you deal with another generation that's going to be governed and governable.
But unless we're very much mistaken, those who are inflicting this upon us are also mortal, and they come and they go, and they are succeeded by they replace themselves or whatever, and they're drawing from the same pool ultimately. The young, sometime naives, whatever, or those that have internalized a certain version of society. So they're not, those that would control us are not immune from the same forces of nature. They have to. So what is it that seems to maintain a determination to sustain control. They're maintaining that, and but as I hear what you're saying, that it would appear that the rest of us are going through this constant period of, I'm awake now. Oh, and now I've had my 3 score and 10, and I'm in the ground, and I can no longer influence events.
It's interesting. Government, I don't want to say like it's a force of evil, but the people who get attracted to this, why does it always? Why is that existing in its iteration? It attracts a certain type of person. It attracts a certain type of spirit, and more often than not, it's not a good one. It's not a good spirit. The people who are good in politics, typically end up with certain treatments, or they just eventually withdraw from politics because it's a disgusting industry. But no, government attracts a certain type of person, which goes back to all the way to the Greeks, and it was Aristotle. I forget who it said. You'll end up getting governed by your inferiors if you don't get involved in politics, and if you don't get involved in politics, it doesn't mean politics is not going to get involved with you. And so, we're dealing with an entity that has a force of its own, that attracts its own energy, that has its own purpose, but a portion of the population that gets awakened and then becomes fewer and fewer in number, and the governable become greater and greater in number. And then you end up with the Alex Joneses, who to the next generation seems crazy until they realize he's not crazy. He just lived through more than you. He's lived through this cycle. And so it's the battle between good and evil. And it'll always exist the way it is. The only thing is, channeling back to one of our talks before, Neil, where he said, it gets not too big to fail, but too big to continue. That is your thought. I've never forgot it. We will get to that point with the government, and it's going to get to a point that's so big. We'll go back to sort of a state of anarchy, which is not lawlessness, but localized power, because people are going to realize that is the next evolution once we reach this pinnacle of madness of government control over all aspects of our lives.
What do you think we're going to see? This is where I'm inviting you to, crystal ball gaze and whatever, but given the events in Pennsylvania with Trump, and let's say that was just an assassination attempt that went awry, and now there's a mad scramble by the would-be perpetrators to get the wheels back on the wagon. And I listen. You've invoked there Alex Jones. I know that he's saying that this will continue, that they'll continue to go after Trump physically. That we saw the CrowdStrike, whatever tech event that immediately that almost swamped the RNC. What do you see coming? Do you see an ever escalating circus of chaos?
Well, it's amazing, and people have to appreciate this, and they won't appreciate it in a year from now because it won't be temporally, relevant. In 1 week, we saw a botched assassination attempt. And I don't say botched because it shouldn't have been botched. It was a miraculous failure. Then we see the CrowdStrike. Then we see Joe Biden withdraw from the election, but hasn't been seen in 5 days. And these are interesting times indeed. The question is, when do they stop, or where do they stop? Jones, he has been through a lot more than us and seen a lot more and been right a lot more. He's been wrong every now and again. And I believe that some people suffer from not conspiracy trauma, but they get conditioned by their life history and what they see to see not what they want, but what they fear. Yes.
I'll just jump in there and say that about Alex Jones. The fact that he does get it wrong now and again actually makes him more credible to me rather than less.
Oh, absolutely.
Because he's clearly not working from a pat script. He's calling it as he sees it, and whatever a large percentage of the time he calls it right. And then sometimes he gets it wrong, but that's just evidence of a thinking man.
Well, and that's what the outcome of the prediction is less relevant than the rationale for the prediction. Because at some point you say, like, here's my reasoning, and now I'm going to pick who's going to win not between sporting teams. That's a little bit more arbitrary, but outcomes of political events. I mean, at some point in time, there's an element of randomness to outcome, but not to reasoning. And Alex Jones's reasoning is, generally speaking, very thorough and very well thought out, even when he gets it wrong. And you can think to the most famous example of him getting it wrong, because he invoked crisis actors in Sandy Hook. But the reasoning is not only not untenable, it's historically justified. There have been crisis actors that have been used and exploited throughout history to generate crisis, to generate to gin up public support for events. They've used crisis actors. They've staged events. He was just wrong on that occasion. And my goodness, have they fully exploited that wrongness? But it's not the prediction of the actual outcome that's the most relevant. It's the rationale and the justification for it. And so when he looks at this and says, here's what they've done in the past, this is what they might do in the future. Everybody's predicting a doom and gloom escalation, October surprise. I don't know, like detonate a false flag nuclear a bomb going off in somewhere in God for freaking bid, in the world. And you can argue for that. One thing is for certain now, another attempted assassination on Trump, the consequences, even God forbid, should be successful, will be radically different than it would have been 2 days before the RNC. And so the timing of that attempt was not an accident. Trump had not yet been formally named the presidential candidate. He hadn't appointed a VP. And the consequences of a successful assassination would have been far more devastating than now that things are a little bit, not more stable, but he's on the ticket. J.D. Vance would replace him. And so the consequences would be different. Where does it go? You can imagine an October surprise that's something like an October 7. They've certainly been laying the groundwork for that, leaving a border open to criminals and terrorists. You can imagine escalation of a war in Europe because they've been talking about Article 5. Joe Biden, in all his dementia, has been talking about Article 5 not for nothing. But I don't know, but I just want to have a little bit of white pill optimism. The October surprise need not necessarily be cataclysmic. It could be good. Like, we could have whistleblowers coming out from the CIA Secret Service saying this was an administration set up for Trump, and just change the trajectory of the world, change the perspective of the world on these federal government agencies that should not exist. So I don't know. I'm hoping for the good, preparing for the bad. I mean, I don't know how you do that if nuclear bombs start going off. Nobody's safe.
Obviously there are. You talk about whatever nuclear war or the detonation of a nuclear device. There are limits to what context you can remain optimistic within. But I would say it's analogous to me to an abscess. If you've ever had a dental abscess or something, which is unspeakably unpleasant, but it has to burst. The relief and the ending of the trauma that comes with that, when the poison comes forth, is necessary. That it seems to me that these people that are driving this have no ideas. They don't have any creativity. They've just got an incredible stubbornness and determination and a drive, but they're using the same tools over and over. And the tools are blunt, and the stories that they're telling are worn out, and the fabric of everything is see-through. And I think there's huge grounds for optimism in that. And I dare say that the chaos will intensify. But again, when it bursts, the wheels need to come off. The big end needs to go in the car before enough people say, now we've got a broken down car. We're going to have to find another way to move ahead.
No, I agree with you because, enough people are saying for enough period of time, they have these congressional hearings and nobody ever faces any consequences. We're going to get to the point where people are going to they're going to actually suffer meaningful consequences, like another church committee type thing. But the abscess analogy, first of all, I can totally relate to it. I frequent a YouTube channel. He's a Scottish farmer who shaves down the lame paws of cows. And, they get abscesses in their paws and they're limp. And then, he scrapes it away with his metal tool and they explode the pus and whatever. And then he disinfects it and it's immediate relief for the cow. So it's a great channel. I just forget the name. I think we're getting to the point where it cannot be hidden anymore. And, that's why there is this battle, a very strong one in Canada, but global, against free speech, against the internet, to try to silence, suppress, demote, penalize the voices that expose this. But you can't do it forever. And I think we might be getting to that point where, the emperor has no clothes. The system is incorrigibly corrupted and needs to be fixed from the bottom up.
I I often, well, for the longest time, I used to worry about, like I'm sure you do, like being cancelled and your channel being shut down, or indeed a cyber attack that brings down the internet. If you just turn off the internet, we won't be able to talk to one another. You and I wouldn't be able to, engage in the way that we are doing now. And it sounds, you think, well, that would be catastrophic. Which in many ways it would, because we've become so dependent in a remarkably short space of time in a set of technologies. And I was saying the other day to someone that I was reading the historian Jan Morris's Pax Britannica, which is a trilogy about the rise and fall of the British Empire. And towards the end of the third book, there's Gandhi and the impact that Gandhi had on the independence movement in India. And I thought, God, he was operating when there was nothing. He was barely telephony. And he was in the poorest country in the world, or one of them, where nobody had anything. And yet his message, permeated to the extent that, well, the objective that he'd been after was achieved. And I thought, it's so important to remember that. That all of the great world-changing messages for the better, often coming from a single individual, never mind a small group, have up until now been put out by people with no technology whatsoever. And yet the message that changed the world.
I mean, you say it, and I have the thought in real time. I mean, the best example being, Jesus himself. 2,000 years ago,
Sermon on the Mount.
It is amazing to think about. I'm not so excuse me. I'm not so worried about a cyber attack that takes down the internet. I think that might be good for everybody. It might be good for community. It would be good for kids. It would be bad for money in terms of the ability to just exist, and it might cause some. It wouldn't be total.
I'd need your address so I could send you a snail mail letter to get back in touch.
What would have to happen? I would have to get in a canoe and paddle across the Atlantic. Nobody, out of the destruction comes a rebirth of sorts. But you're right. We don't know where it's going to go. It's going to be a wild next 6 months. But what a time to be alive, Neil. I'm here so long as I have a camera and I can record for as long as the battery lasts in case of an ultimate shutdown. I'll be happy. Go back to the old school technology, photography, and wait for the infrastructure to be set back up.
Yes, I take great solace from the fact that my kids are analog increasingly. They've got mobile phones and whatever, and I've got a typewriter. I've got a manual typewriter. I've been relearning I can touch type on a computer keyboard quite happily, but I've been relearning how to touch type on a manual typewriter, and it's good to be reminded that all those means are still there, and the younger generations are finding their way to them as well as Luddite dinosaurs like me.
I say, so long as the kids know how to fish, they'll be relatively safe, relatively self-sustainable.
Yeah, David, I'm going to let you go. I'm watching the clock here, and I always try to keep these to a reasonable time frame for everyone. Lovely. I've been looking forward to this conversation for ages. It's taken me the devil's own time to set this one up. I don't know why or how, but nonetheless, we've got an hour recorded, and I'll look forward to many more conversations.
Absolutely. And
David Freiheit, thank you very much.
Thank you. You got to come on mine sooner than later, and we'll do it. I'll be back in America.
Tell me when. I'll be there.
Amazing.